Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday old school edition of the PipeBomb Wrestling Podcast. I am your host for this episode, the Young Buck, Andy York. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to us, whether it's on Sportinarium, whether it's on bodyslam.net, whether you're just listening to us in the podcast version. We really appreciate your support and listening to each and every single episode. It really means a lot to us and continues to push us forward as we are putting out more and more content each and every week. And so we are very, very excited about that. This episode this week is going to be very special because as of December 15th, which is technically 2 days after this episode is going out, was the debut of Bret Hart in WCW. So we're going to be looking at the entire WCW run of Bret Hart from the Montreal Screwjob to the kick heard around the world, basically, is I'm pretty sure what it's known as now. And so we're going to cover all of that. But obviously I cannot do this by myself because I am not a big Bret Hart guy. So we are going to bring in the actual host of the PipeBomb Wrestling Podcast, Chris Belcher, which I'm sure going to get as much heat for saying that as I did for saying I never really watched the Vader match because I got a couple of tweets about that. But, you know, I'm the Young Buck, so Bret Hart was not in my era at all. So I have to kind of go back and watch him. But we're happy to have Chris with us here to kind of dive into this entire run. Chris, how you doing, man?
Man, I'm doing well. I'm glad that we're doing this. I have to say, when me and friends of the show, Jason Bakowitz and Jared Justice, started this podcast almost 4 years ago now, I never thought we would do a whole episode on Bret Hart in the WCW. But here we are. It seems like a fine time to do it. And it's a fun topic to dive into because just like you, I'm not a Bret Hart guy either.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm not alone.
So yeah, I'm going to put out the disclaimer before we even start this that back in the Monday Night War days, or at least in the 95, 96 era in the WWF, I felt like because there was such a rivalry with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels that you couldn't be a fan of both. You had to choose. Yep. So I was a Shawn Michaels fan and I can't stand Bret Hart. So, but I respect what he's done in the business. He's had some, honestly, man, if I go back and look at some of my favorite matches, top 15, 20 matches of all time or whatever, there's going to be a couple Bret Hart matches on there. Yep. So I certainly respect his body of work. And I just think he's full of himself, but I'll get that out of the way now.
Most old school wrestlers are, so that's
just true. That's
just a common trait of that time. I will say, true. I think he does have one of the best WrestleMania matches of all time with Steve Austin with Stone Cold. Mm-hmm. WrestleMania 13, when they did the unthinkable of the double turn and everything else. That's still an amazing match. So that was one of the first Bret Hart matches I went back and watched was that one, and then I went back and watched his. I think it was a SummerSlam match against the British Bulldog. That was
you
really
did
good.
Hit the two best ones right out the gate. So
I did. That's the ones I've heard about the most. So I was like, we'll go downhill from here, but it's fine.
I'll jump in before we get started here since we're talking about recommending Bret Hart matches. For those of you who out there who might be a young buck like Andy York and don't know the body of work that is Bret the Hitman Hart, obviously if you can sit through an hour match that doesn't have any major high spots, the Iron Man match against Shawn Michaels WrestleMania 12 is obviously one to watch if you're looking for a technical masterpiece. That's what that one is. I would also recommend going back to WrestleMania 8, Bret Hart's Intercontinental title match against Roddy Piper. Piper's only singles championship run that he ever had. Came to an end that night. So an incredible match with him and Bret. And then also SummerSlam 1991, Bret Hart versus Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. That's a fantastic match to go back and watch. And then I'll throw one more, Survivor Series 1995, Bret Hart and Diesel for the World Heavyweight Championship. Bret Hart was arguably Diesel's best opponent ever, had some of the best matches with him. So go back and check out those couple, and that gives you a good look at Bret's body of work, at least in the WWF.
Yeah, because if you're anything like me, my first ever Bret Hart match was the one with him and Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 26. So that was my first introduction to Bret Hart. So that's why I was like, I don't understand the hype behind this guy. And then went back and watched his other stuff. I was like, I get it. I understand now. I understand. So yeah, but we're going to educate a lot of us about Bret Hart and about his WCW run, which had a lot of potential, had a lot of intrigue around it, especially after his departure from WWF and going into WCW. There was a lot of potential and a lot of hype, and then not a lot of payoff as kind of the consensus around Bret Hart's WCW run, which is kind of this is kind of the beginning of the end of WCW is during kind of this time. So we're gonna dive in and jump into all of that.
And surprise, surprise, it centers around Starrcade 97.
I can already feel the blood pressure rising. Anyway, so let's start back at the beginning, not necessarily at the beginning of his career, but at the beginning of the end of his WWF run, going into his run in WCW. We have to talk about Survivor Series. We have to talk about the Montreal Screwjob. We have to talk about all of the circumstances around that. I was barely alive when this happened, so that I don't have any recollection of this at all. But from your perspective, or from watching it or hearing about it or whatever, what was kind of your attitude going towards it? Because obviously at the time nobody really knew if this was a planned thing, if it wasn't a planned thing. Nobody really knew the circumstances behind it like we do now. So what was your initial reaction to the Montreal Screwjob?
Survivor Series 1997. That's in November, so a month before my birthday. I was a mere 8 years old, about to turn 9. So 8-year-old Chris Belcher, all he was worried about was Shawn Michaels winning the title back. Could care less how it happened, just wanted it to happen. And it did happen. Now, I honestly did not understand the weight of what had actually happened when it happened. Obviously going back later on and diving into all this, I still go back and forth every time I revisit the screw job to decide if it was a work or if it was a shoot. But that's a topic for another conversation, because that's a huge rabbit hole that we could spend an hour on. So I legit go back and forth between if I think it's a work or a shoot. Depends on which angle I look at it from. Obviously, if we're looking at it from a Bret Hart angle, it feels very, very, very much like a shoot. But as we said earlier, most old school wrestlers, they do a pretty good job of hiding kayfabe.
Yes,
so
they do.
I don't know. Anyway, before I go down that rabbit hole, let me move on. But honestly, and then seeing Bret Hart show up in WCW about 3 weeks later, it was kind of like, okay, cool. So from an 8-year-old's perspective, it was just the whole fanboy thing. But, looking at it, obviously from a 30,000-foot view many years later, it's a crazy thing, man, because Bret Hart blames Vince, and Vince blames Bret, and Bret blames Shawn, and Shawn blames Bret. And nobody wants to take the blame.
Yep.
Vince ultimately said, okay, I'll take the blame for it. But still, many years later in 2010, they, Bret, Shawn, and Vince, they buried the hatchet or whatever. But I still think there's a lot of finger pointing and all that kind of stuff, especially, man, if you watch the Broken Skull sessions with Steve Austin, the Bret Hart interview, he seems like he gets pretty heated when they start talking about the screw job. And that was just like last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't blame the guy for getting heated. I mean, whether it was a work or a shoot or whatever, it the circumstances around it were very, very bad, but in a lot of ways it gave birth to probably the greatest heel of all time in Vince McMahon. So I think that it definitely has its good and bad aspects of it. So kind of the Montreal Screwjob has happened. Whether you talk to Bret Hart, who says it's a shoot, whether you talk to Kevin Nash, who says it's a work, you kind of get you kind of have differing opinions. Like you said, that's an episode by itself. He beats the crap out of the monitor. He throws the monitor right to WCW, which is like the thing that everybody one of the things that everybody remembers. Spits on Vince. Apparently goes backstage and knocks Vince out, the whole 9 yards. Him and Shawn. Shawn does a very good job. If it is a shoot, Shawn does a very good job of trying to play it off as not knowing. I love the fact that Bret Hart's wife was like all up in Triple H's face, yelling and screaming at him. Like it was just it was absolute chaos that broke out after that. And then we go into Bret Hart leaving WWF to go into WCW for more money and less dates. I believe is basically the whole. Bret wanted the whole contract dispute. He wanted more money, but he didn't want to work as many of the dates, and so WCW definitely could offer that at the time. And so they brought in Bret Hart, and yeah, so kind of talk about the debut of Bret Hart. Talk about the impact of him showing up on Nitro, or him showing up in WCW, and kind of going from there.
Well, there's two sides to that. And before that I go any further with Bret Hart and WCW, because again, much like the Montreal screw job, and much like Bret Hart's whole career, really, there's two sides to every story.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's that way with everything, but it truly is with Bret Hart. So much like Hulk Hogan, I'm not saying that everything that comes out of Bret Hart's mouth is a lie. I'm not saying that.
Right.
But Bret has the tendency to embellish things and make things seem more in his favor than maybe it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So, much like his book that I tried to read multiple times and I couldn't get past chapter 3. And that's a shoot, guys. That's no joke. I tried and I couldn't do it. The guy just anyway. So coming into WCW, like you alluded to earlier, it was the beginning of the end of WCW, and it started with Starrcade, but he came in 2 weeks before Starrcade. And I think Bischoff tried to capitalize on what happened with Bret and WWF, and he made Bret the special guest referee or the special guest enforcer or whatever. That way that he could come in and make the save and be a babyface and kumbaya kind of thing. But, obviously Starrcade didn't happen the way that we all thought it should have, or, a monkey could have booked that show. But anyway, so ultimately Bret Hart comes right into WCW in controversy.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves with controversy and he comes in with controversy. So I think WCW, and you're going to see this theme throughout this podcast, WCW had no idea what to do with Bret Hart.
Yep.
They had no idea because their show wasn't based on wrestling, and Bret Hart was a wrestler. Bret Hart had a bit of a character, but Bret Hart was based in wrestling. In WCW, there was no room for wrestlers unless you were under 200 pounds and could do flips and moonsaults and all this other stuff. That's the only wrestling WCW cared about.
Yeah. And so there was definitely the gimmick based, like the bigger the character, the better. That's why people like Hulk Hogan was so prominent, and Goldberg, who was not ever the best wrestler, but he was just a big powerhouse guy that could come in. Sting was really good in the ring, but his gimmick, his character, hanging out in the rafters and all of that, definitely was playing a part in that as well.
Sure.
And so kind of like you said, Bret Hart has been, always will be a wrestler through and through. And that was not necessarily on display in WCW. So he was definitely brought in to be just a big name, to get people to come in and tune in, which WCW had a long track record of having guys like that, with Hogan, with Macho Man, with insert name here. You can kind of go down the list with that. So kind of his first introduction, which we're not going to talk about Starrcade 97. We're going to try to go around it as much as we can for Chris's health's benefit.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
But I think it is very interesting, kind of like you said, because the booking of this Starrcade was something. The fact that they had him come out, even though, basically it was 3 weeks after, I think it was, like you said, 3 weeks after the Montreal Screwjob, after Survivor Series, you have Starrcade. He comes in to do a special guest referee, which is kind of mind-boggling that he wasn't just involved in like an actual physical match as like as a guest or whatever. Kind of talk about the early booking woes, because there was a lot of them, of Bret Hart in WCW.
Well, again, like I said, they didn't know what to do with him. So you would think that his first feud, when he comes in, if he screws over Hulk Hogan for the championship, you would think that he would feud with Hulk Hogan after Sting wins the championship. You would, right? Doesn't 2 + 2 = 4?
Yeah.
So Bret Hogan, the long-awaited matchup that we did not get in WWF, that was obviously it was supposed to happen if you believe Bret Hart,
Mm-hmm.
and Hogan dodged it and left WWF in '93 and whatever. So that should have been the first storyline, and that would have automatically put Bret Hart in the main event picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, his first storyline ends up being with Ric Flair. I get okay, that's fine. If it's not Hogan, it's Flair. Cool. The problem with Ric Flair in the end of 97, 98 is he wasn't positioned to be a main event guy.
Right.
So you put Bret Hart in that feud. Okay, great. Bret comes in as a wrestler. Who's another wrestler we can put him with? Ric Flair. Okay, that should be great, right? Well, it was fine until they ended up getting somewhere mixed up. I don't remember the exact timeline of when this happened. I think it was around March, April-ish, I believe. Yeah, April. That's what it was. Is Bret becomes a sympathizer,
Mm-hmm.
An associate of the NWO, but not an actual member. I was like, well, wait a minute. Why does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I just, again, you've got one of the best wrestlers ever. You put him in the ring with Ric Flair. Okay, cool. But I don't know. Just like this whole, it's like everybody had to be in the NWO. You know what I mean? The
Right.
NWO was the greatest thing and it was the worst thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was obviously one of the biggest complaints about the NWO is that while expanding is never really been done before in that aspect, and it was an interesting idea, it got way too big, way too quick, and kind of imploded itself. So kind of like you said, he comes into WCW. He screws over Hogan. Never really wrestles Hogan that much. He wrestles Ric Flair. He goes into feud with Ric Flair. He ends up fighting multiple members of the NWO at times. He goes into a feud with Lex Luger. He goes into a lot of different feuds, but nothing really necessarily high profile. So kind of like, because you've always said that you were a WWF guy.
At points,
At
yes.
points, and so during this point, what were you more of a WWF guy because of Sean, or were you kind of bouncing back and forth, or where were your allegiance during this time? I guess.
Well, Sean was on his way out.
Yeah.
As we all know, Sean wrestled his last match at WrestleMania 14, which was in March of that year.
Mm-hmm.
And then that ushered in the Austin era, the Attitude Era, that kind of thing. So, peek behind the curtain, my parents did not want me watching WWF in the Attitude Era for obvious reasons. I don't know who in their right mind would want their 9-year-old to be watching what WWF was putting out. So, my allegiance by default was to WCW at this point. And like I said, Bret Hart to me was like the other guy. So there was Sean and there was Bret. Bret was still the other guy, even though Sean wasn't even in the picture, even though he was in WCW. Bret was still like the other guy. So I'm not saying I didn't pay attention to Bret, but this was 98. This was Sting finally winning the world championship. So I don't want to say that I turned the television off when Bret came on, but he wasn't a huge concern because I think honestly because of the booking, like his stuff just didn't feel important.
Yeah. So then, kind of like you said, in April of let me try that again. Of April of that year, he kind of randomly turned heel, joined the NWO, helped Hogan regain the WCW championship, and like you said, he would become an associate of the NWO without becoming an official member. And this kind of led to matches with Randy Savage. This kind of led to matches with him. So another kind of feels like trying to relive the glory days in some ways during this time with Bret Hart instead of, putting him in there with younger talent and letting them kind of go together. But because I think that's one of the things he wanted to transition to during this time was, yeah, he still wanted to be like a top guy, but he didn't mind. Like he would have worked, with younger talent. Maybe not necessarily put them over, but it's kind of one of those, when you're in the ring with Bret Hart, you automatically, your stock kind of goes up a little because you
Yep,
share the ring
that's
with
it.
Bret Hart. So he goes through, he fights Savage, which he won because of, shocker, interference due to Hogan, which was kind of like the theme of every single WCW pay per view during this time. Then you had, let's see here, you had Bret going through these matches. I think a couple of them, or one of them, was with special guest referee, which was Roddy Piper. They kind of went back and forth. And then you kind of continue to see Bret kind of going down this rabbit hole of just facing random people for no reason at times. Which leads us to July of that year, when Bret Hart defeated DDP to win his first ever WCW championship, the U.S. championship, and would go on to hold it 4 times actually in WCW, which is kind of surprising that he held it that many times, because he's only in the company for 3 years. It was a 3-year contract,
tops. Yeah,
I
tops.
think. And he took, obviously he took some time off when Owen Hart passed away, and so he took some time off there. So it was kind of basically like 2 years and some change. And he won the WCW US Championship 4 times.
But context, you got to remember, WCW, their titles were props. I mean, so I think there was one US title run where he was champ. Luger beat him on Nitro, and he won it back on Thunder, which was like a day or two later. So,
championship. That was just kind of the times too, because WWF during the Attitude Era, their championships were passed around a whole lot.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, it was definitely the times of the wrestling business, which sucks. But that's, that was the time that we were living
in. So then he would feud with guys like Lex Luger, and they basically passed the title back and forth a couple times before everything happened. Before he went on to have a feud with Sting for a little bit. And then in early 1990, he dropped the title to Roddy Piper. And then the following month, he appeared in street clothes and called out Goldberg. So this is kind of where we see Bret Hart versus Goldberg, which was something all of in itself. So kind of, because to kind of talk about this rise of Bret Hart in WCW, you also have to talk about the rise of Bill Goldberg during that time as well. Kind of talk about that. Talk about like the rise of Goldberg in WCW. Obviously, his 150 win streak, which I don't think it was actually 150. I think it was.
It wasn't. It was 167 or 168.
Yeah. So, which is ridiculous that man won that many matches. But kind of talk about the rise of Bill Goldberg heading into 1999 with Bret Hart.
Well, like you alluded to earlier, Goldberg was a powerhouse. Goldberg couldn't wrestle a whole lot. Goldberg was very green. He was straight off of the football field into the power plant, trained for a little bit, and then they got him on television as soon as they could. I think he debuted in like September of 97. Something, I could be wrong on that, but that sounds right to me. Debuted in September of 97. He wins the U.S. title first. And then Goldberg, like you said, he rose all the way through 98. He beats Hogan in July of 98 for the championship, and he holds the title all the way to Starrcade 98, where he drops it to Kevin Nash, and that's where the infamous streak ends. So I guess with Bret Hart coming in, it was just bad timing, because you bring in this really established, well-known guy who you can capitalize momentum with in Bret Hart, or you've got this new up-and-coming star Goldberg who everybody is getting behind and you can't ignore, and you have to just ride Goldberg all the way. I get that. That's cool. That's fine. What I would have done is I would have had Sting obviously win the title clean at Starrcade. And then I would have built to Starrcade the following year, Sting versus Bret Hart. Because I feel like that's one of the dream matches that we all want to see. Now, we saw it at Halloween Havoc, like you alluded to, when Bret injured Sting, which in all actuality, Sting had to go out and have some surgery anyway. But he injured Sting at Halloween Havoc, and that's the first encounter we really saw with them. But I would have built that to Sting as a babyface, Bret as a heel, like we got, but for the championship. Right. To me, that would have set Bret up to be the guy. You still could have had Hogan looming around, but then you've got Goldberg on the rise. So then you could have Goldberg and Bret Goldberg take the title from Bret. Obviously, Goldberg taking the title from Hogan, nobody's going to complain about that.
Right.
But for the subject of this show in Bret Hart, he just got the raw end of the deal as far as the momentum of Goldberg. That's not something you could help. We could sit here and complain about Bret's booking all day long.
Right.
But the momentum and the groundswell for Goldberg, that's not something you can ignore. So kudos to WCW for recognizing that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just unfortunate that Bret was on the back end of that, and then he meets Goldberg later, and
yeah,
that's how it all ends.
Yeah, and it's amazing because there's only a few times in really wrestling history where you catch lightning in the bottle. I mean, you got to think like Goldberg during this time. More recently, Daniel Bryan heading into WrestleMania 30, Kofi Kingston heading into WrestleMania 35, like things like that.
Becky Lynch heading into WrestleMania 35.
Yeah, so like catching lightning in a bottle like that is something that, even the psychotic Vince McMahon in modern times cannot even really ignore.
Right.
And so that was kind of the rise of Goldberg during this time. We get the infamous Goldberg going to spear Bret Hart. Bret Hart is wearing the metal chest plate basically and knocking out Goldberg, and then looking down camera and say, "Hey Bischoff, WCW, I quit." And so kind of walks off a little bit and leaves. And then during that time is also when the unfortunate passing of Owen Hart took place, and so he took some time to obviously deal with that grief, deal with that difficulty. And so he returned in September of '99, teaming with Hogan against Sting and Luger. He would go on to beat Goldberg for the U.S. Championship, and then he would drop the belt to Scott Hall before winning the WCW title tournament, defeating Perry Saturn, Billy Kidman, and Sting and Chris Benoit at Mayhem.
He also defeated Goldberg by disqualification to start that tournament, which a lot of people don't remember.
Yeah.
But before we let's backtrack just a minute here. To the spear with the chest plate. Now, of all of the bad things, I don't know whose idea this was, but of all the bad things that Bret Hart did in WCW and all of the issues that he had, he credits this moment as one of his favorite moments of his time in WCW. Was this one and the match you alluded to when he came back. I think it was in October when he wrestled Chris Benoit on WCW's Owen Hart tribute show. Those two are his favorite moments in WCW, in his tenure in WCW. So nobody, aside from the NWO, had really shown Goldberg up like that. And Bret did it sort of on the way out because he was having to have some surgery and he was going to take some time off. So huge moment right there. And then huge moment when he comes back. He has the excellent match with Chris Benoit on Monday Nitro on the Owen Hart tribute show. And then Bret finally gets his shot in a tournament, wins the WCW title against Chris Benoit in the finals at Mayhem, which was in Canada, WCW's first pay-per-view in Canada. So big moment. WCW is known for trying to right the ship at the wrong time. They try to do the right thing a little too late. So Bret getting the title in '99, who knows what it could have led to, because ultimately we're going to talk about Starrcade a month later.
Right.
But it just seems like they should have done this with Bret sooner.
Yeah. So before we get to that infamous now Starrcade match, we actually have to talk about his run kind of a little bit before that with the tag team championships, because he held tag gold with none other than Bill Goldberg, which I think was one of those cases of, can they coexist? They win a tag, which sidebar, I've always hated that because it makes your other tag teams look really weak because they lose the two guys that are just kind of thrown together in a feud, which I hated it when they did it with Cena and Miz. I think they did it heading into their WrestleMania match, and then Cena and David Otunga won it when he was forced to join the Nexus. So like that whole thing has always been dumb to me.
Anyway, Cena and Shawn did it.
Cena and Batista did it, I think, too.
Yep.
So
I think
Seth Rollins and Braun Strowman did it a few years ago.
Seth and Braun did it. Several guys
Yeah.
have done it, but
Yeah.
like to your point, it looks like that booking crosses over to WCW as well
Yeah.
because it's Bret and Goldberg. So you have to kind of give WCW credit here. I know we're sort of crapping on the booking of Bret Hart, but you have to give them credit for following up. They were doing this at the beginning of '99 was the spear chest plate deal.
Yep.
The end of '99 is their Starrcade match for the World Heavyweight Championship.
Yep.
So WCW was continuing that feud just in a
Mhm.
different way.
Yep. So we get their tag team run. I don't know how long they actually held the belt. I don't think it was for very long.
Long enough for me not to remember it.
Yeah. They dropped the belts. I don't know who they dropped the belts to because it doesn't really matter. And then we
Doesn't
head
matter.
into the Starrcade match that would eventually inevitably end Bret Hart's career for the most part. He did have one more match after that, but it was I don't really know if you can call it a match in some ways. Anyways, so we have this match Bret Hart versus Sting or versus Goldberg. Goldberg is very what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like he still is today, very um aggressive in the ring, I think is a good way to put it, a nice way
Mhm,
to put it.
mhm.
He's not necessarily the safest guy to be in the ring with. And he goes to hit a super kick on Bret Hart and legitimately kicks him in the face hard enough. And Bret Hart suffers, I believe, a stroke after this. Um,
I think it was multiple concussions
yeah,
here, and then later on, I think he had a stroke in I don't remember what year it was,
yeah,
um, but yeah, it caused it for sure.
yeah, yeah. And so what was kind of supposed to be a good moment or a big moment kind of ended in a sour way. Do you remember this match? Do you remember your kind of initial thoughts, reactions after this match? Kind of take us um through this Starrcade and through kind of what happened.
You know, at the time, because it was only concussions, guys wrestled through concussions all the time back in
Yeah,
those days because it wasn't as big of a deal as it is now. But um, so Brett wrestled for about a month or so after
yeah,
this, and then he ultimately retired in 2000, and then that's when the health problems started. So Starrcade '99, I also remember Sting and Luger fought that night. So I remember it being a thing, but I don't remember, like I said, I don't remember it being a big thing because
right,
Brett was still around. You know what I
right,
mean?
yeah,
Much like the screw job, the weight of it didn't come until way
later,
later, you know? Um, but I do remember finally we're gonna get this singles match between Goldberg and Bret Hart, and it just didn't turn out the way that we wanted it to, for obvious reasons because of what happened with Bret. But Bret has gone on record saying that Goldberg is such a dangerous guy to work with. He legitimately kicked me in the head, ended my career, and he just wasn't a good guy to be able to work with. But I'll flip that to the other side. I started this off with a disclaimer that you can't believe everything that comes out of Bret Hart's mouth. We also can't believe everything that comes out of Eric Bischoff's mouth, but I'm getting ready to quote him. Okay. Bischoff has gone on record and saying, look, Bret Hart just didn't like anybody. He didn't want to work with anybody. He didn't like
Mhm.
Flair. He didn't like Goldberg. He didn't like Hall or Nash or anything like that. That's quotes from Eric Bischoff. He said he would show up to the building 45 minutes before showtime, expect to be booked. And we're like, now Bret has gone on the record and said he was notorious for being late through his whole career. But at the same time, for a guy to come in that late all the time just shows that you don't have respect for what you're doing.
Right,
So I feel like that, yes, Bret has a gripe about Goldberg because he was dangerous in the ring, but I also feel like that there's gripes to be made on the other side. I'm not saying Bret was to blame here,
right,
but it's just a perfect storm of attitudes and a bad situation that ultimately culminated in Bret Hart's final real match.
yeah. Yeah, and so like you said, after this match, he did wrestle for a little while. After that, he basically in his last match in WCW, he defended the WCW championship against Kevin Nash. on January 10th edition of Nitro, which, shocker, ended in a no contest, which
Of course it did.
of course it did during that time, which we also have to mention, I believe this was during, I think this was during Russo. I think that's,
Yes.
we talked about this before. This was part of the Good, the Bad, and the Russo of
Mhm.
WCW.
Yep.
So the match ended in no contest. Obviously, Hart vacated the title a little bit later, when he was forced to withdraw from the main event because of his injuries, and then the company terminated his contract, and then he officially announced his retirement from pro wrestling in
Yes, they
2000.
terminated his contract the exact same way that WCW terminated the contract of one Steve Austin. They terminated them via FedEx.
Yep. Yep.
Unreal. Just ridiculous.
Yep.
God.
So, we kind of covered a lot of stuff during this. We've talked about a lot of the bad, because I think most people would agree that a majority of his WCW run was not up to the standard that we were expecting.
Sure.
He did have some high profile feuds, like we said, with Hogan, with Sting, with Flair, with Savage, some other people. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, because I didn't tell you this beforehand that I was going to do this. I'm going to put you on the spot like you do to me sometimes.
Okay.
If you had to describe his WCW run in one word, how would you describe it? And then you can go into more detail. But what would that word be?
I would just say disappointing. Because I think WCW could have done some good stuff with him.
Mm-hmm.
It was just right place, wrong time. WCW, we often hear that there wasn't, one person that the buck stopped with. It was, many people would like to say it was Eric Bischoff. No, it clearly wasn't, because Hogan wasn't taking direction from Bischoff. Kevin Nash wasn't taking direction from Eric Bischoff. So the list goes on and on.
Right.
So nobody really knew what was happening. So they didn't know what to do with Bret. On the flip side of that, I'll quote Bischoff again, and I'll say Bischoff has said that Bret didn't come to the table with any ideas either.
Mm-hmm.
So can't necessarily put all the blame on WCW. You can place some blame on Bret, because, as I said a few minutes ago, he'd show up to the building 45 minutes before TV. He wouldn't come with any ideas. How do you expect to work with somebody like that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Well, I feel like WCW during that time, because I hate the comparisons of like AEW to WCW, because they're two different. They're, in a lot of ways they're the same, but they're also kind of two different things at the same time.
Sure.
But I feel like they were kind of the same way of they wanted their wrestlers to be the creative at times behind some of their story, especially like a guy like Bret Hart. If he comes in with a story or like a creative idea, you're going to be more apt to listen to him and do it, at least find a way to combine your two stories together to make it really good. But if he's not coming up with that and you're kind of by yourself, it kind of goes one way, because wrestlers are, like we always talk about, it's a sport, but it's also an art form. Like you have to be creative to be anything in this business, and I think that's kind of where he struggled as well. And like you said, in WCW.
And I'll give you a perfect example of that in WCW and why that did work in WCW. The perfect example is Chris Jericho.
Yep.
If you look at Chris Jericho in end of 97, maybe middle of 97, I don't remember exact timeline, but they weren't doing anything with him. He was a guy that they were using in the cruiserweight division that didn't belong in the cruiserweight division. So he would come to TV and he would say, "Hey, can I have 1 minute to cut a promo after the match or before the match?" And they'd say, "Sure, why not?" So he would use that 1 minute and it would work. Yep. 1 would turn into 2, 2 would turn into 4. Before you know it, he's ripping the announcer's suit, bringing him another one, then throwing a tantrum and ripping it again. Mm-hmm. Then he's reading an entire list of his 1,004 holds.
Through like 2 commercial breaks, wasn't it?
All of that was organic because that was all Jericho. Nobody wrote that for him. Yep. So then that leads to him coming out and calling out Goldberg and having his personal security and then doing the backstage walks like Goldberg did. That was all Chris Jericho. That was all organic. Imagine if he would have been able to call out, so Goldberg was the big star in the company. Okay, that's great. But the fans wanted to see Goldberg just kill Chris Jericho.
Yeah.
Imagine if he would have called out Bret Hart.
Yep.
You imagine Bret Hart working with that Chris Jericho?
Oh yeah.
The heat that Jericho would have gotten for Bret, and Jericho would have put him over.
Yep.
So, to talk about opponents that Bret could have faced, I think him and Jericho in '98 would have just been money.
Yep.
But that being said, Jericho came with ideas. I'm not saying Bret didn't come with any. Bischoff just says he didn't contribute. So we just have to take it for what it's worth.
Yep. And I think you've said it perfectly a couple times. It was Bret was in the right company just at the wrong time.
Yep.
Because this was after Starrcade 97, this was definitely the downfall of WCW, which would basically inevitably run the company completely out of business.
Yeah. Because look at the other side. 1997 was Bret's probably most successful year in WWF because he was a babyface in Canada and he was a heel everywhere else. And it worked perfectly. He had a great year in 97. Okay, let's turn the page to 1998. Let's go into the Attitude Era. Would Bret Hart, the excellence of execution, the best there is, best there was, and best there ever will be, do you think he would have fit into Vince Russo's writing in the Attitude Era? Right. Absolutely not.
Right.
Owen Hart didn't fit into it.
Yeah.
Davey Boy Smith got fed up with it. He left. Jim Neidhart left.
Yeah.
So Bret would have been like a fish out of water the same way he was in WCW.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of talent he could have worked with in either company. So I wish Bret would have been in WCW in like 95. If Bret would have been WCW 95, landscape would have been different.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And so that's kind of the run of Bret Hart through from Montreal Screwjob to the Kick, and then kind of his end of his career. Obviously, he's done a couple of things since then. I think he's only had the one match. Technically two. He's technically had two because
he had a couple. Yeah,
he was the U.S. champion in 2010 as well. Beat the Miz. I think he beat the Miz for it.
He did, yeah.
And then vacated it. I think because the Nexus attacked him or whatever. Which that was a whole weird time during that time period as well. Obviously now he is the most recent appearance I can think of was besides being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame and watching the Revival beat the crap out of that guy. Then he introduces. He's the first one to introduce the AEW Championship in AEW. So he's still definitely playing a big part in professional wrestling. He obviously is a massive inspiration to a lot of people out inside WWE, inside AEW, all around the world. He has been that. His purple attire is iconic at this point. The purple and black, which Natalia is still trying to rip off. Pink and black, not purple. Pink and black that Natalia is still trying to rip off. And so you kind of
She's in the family. She's allowed.
She is allowed. I guess she's allowed. Anyways, we're gonna leave that alone. I'm not a big Natalia fan. Kind of. What are your wrapping up as we're kind of wrapping up on this episode because there's not a whole lot left to talk about, but kind of in your words, what was the Bret Hart WCW run like? Kind of closing thoughts on from the Montreal Screwjob to the Kick, even to modern day now. Kind of his legacy in WCW and on.
Honestly, it had the potential, obviously, but we just right place, wrong time with Goldberg. You know what I mean? Goldberg had that company by the throat, and that's what they had to run with, and that's what they ran with. And Bret Hart was ultimately a victim of that, no pun intended. But he was. Other than that, though, he had some. You go back and watch some of these matches. We mentioned the Benoit match and the Sting match from the Mayhem pay-per-view. The Benoit match from the Owen Tribute show in October of '99. Sting match at Halloween Havoc. Then you had Halloween Havoc 98. Then you have the DDP stuff. It was really, really good. I honestly went back and watched a lot of this stuff in preparation for this show. And a lot of those matches were really, really good. But like I said earlier, there was no room for good wrestling in WCW at this juncture. because Russo's coming in. It's all gaga and it's all interference and yada, yada, yada. So ultimately, I don't want to say Bret did the right thing for leaving the WWF, but the business wouldn't be where it was had Bret not gone to WCW and not the screw job hadn't happened. Literally a turning point for the entire wrestling business.
Yep.
That night, right there.
Because there's an argument that, I mean, the argument could be made that if the Montreal Screwjob doesn't happen, the Heel McMahon doesn't happen, and if the Heel McMahon doesn't happen, then you might not have the Stone Cold Steve Austin that you have.
Right.
And so it kind of, the whole landscape of everything would have changed drastically if that didn't take place.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all that to say, to wrap this up, it's a great thing that Bret Hart went to WCW. Does it suck for him that the way it all wrapped up and the way it all ended and the bad hand that he was dealt? Absolutely. But I will say it's probably, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad that he wasn't in WWF when Owen passed away. That's not a rabbit hole I necessarily want to go down. But I'll just say that it's a good thing he went to WCW because it changed the landscape of the wrestling business for the better.
Yep, absolutely. I completely agree. All right. Anything else that you'd want to add about Bret Hart or about the show or about anything before we
I just, again, like I said at the top, this is not an episode I ever thought that I would do. But it's fun to look at Bret Hart and a different part of his career that nobody really talks about. You know what I mean? It would be like talking about the British Bulldog and his second run in WCW. Who remembers that? Well, it happened.
Right.
So, but it's definitely a different topic to talk about. I hope everybody that's listening enjoyed the show. I hope that if you want to hear more obscure topics like this, you make sure you let us know. We like to do things around anniversaries, thematic stuff, things that are in the news. So you want to hear more stuff like this, make sure you follow us, drop us a line at PBW Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm at Chris Belcher 24. Andy is at Andy_PBWP. We love fan interaction. We love talking about old school stuff and new school stuff. I like to educate Andy. I like for him to educate me. So I feel like this is as good a time as any to go ahead and plug this, Andy, because we've been teasing this Starrcade stuff.
Yeah.
For a long time, and you keep teeing me up and then taking it away from me. Well, in 2 weeks, we are going to air a special old school Monday edition of the show. It will be myself and it will be Jared Justice returning to the show. It will be a previously recorded show that we did. I think we did this back in 2018, maybe 2019, where we talk about Starrcade. And if you want to hear me get animated and talk about this show, get ready. In 2 weeks, it's going to happen. We will air it on our feed, and we'll make sure to plug it next week as well.
Consider it our Christmas present to all of our fans at the PipeBomb Wrestling
Merry
Podcast.
Christmas
Merry
to
Christmas.
all.
Here
you
comes
get to hear me go
Scrooge with Starrcade. So
hey, if they would have booked it right, you wouldn't have me all animated and all Scrooge-like.
That's true. That's very true. That's very true. The most animated I ever get is when Goldberg shows up, and that's not even. I just boo. So it's fine. I get heated every once in a while. There have been a couple of times where I've wanted to ram my head through a wall because of some booking, but nothing like Starrcade 97 for you, I'm sure. So mine's more with Kentucky basketball and football that makes me get that fired up when I think of the Florida game a couple years ago when we let them when it was basically 11-10 at one point because we left the guy off the field twice. Yeah, my blood
was wide open twice.
My blood pressure's already rising. Anyways, let's call it an episode before I have to go to the hospital. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to us each and every week. Make sure you check us out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday is the old school, Wednesday is the new product, and Friday is our Flashback Friday episodes where we post old episodes that we have done. So definitely go check that out. That's obviously some stuff that we have covered in the past that you want to go check out. Some stuff that we have referred to in other episodes. Definitely want you to go check that out as well. Make sure you go buy yourself a wonderful, lovely t-shirt at prowrestlingtees.com. Make sure you go buy a t-shirt. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and all social media stuff. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy_PBWP. You can follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Belcher 24. You can follow the podcast at PBW Podcast on all social media. Once again, we'd like to thank you, bodyslam.net, for allowing us to be a part of your family and posting on your YouTube channel and everything. We really appreciate that, as well as SportsWire for letting us go out there and to have the audio version of our episodes going there as well. We really appreciate it, and we really enjoy doing this. It's a lot of fun to look back at old school stuff and talk about new school stuff, and seeing a lot of history repeating itself in some ways and seeing some new things coming into the product as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and we're really looking forward to continuing moving forward. So once again, thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to us. For Chris, I'm Andy. We will catch you guys down the road.